Hello and welcome back to Sean in the Shed. And on the show today, we've got Sammy Wright, who's talking to us from Sunderland. Hi, Sammy, how are you?
Hi there, I'm good.
And maybe you can just introduce yourself to the audience. We always start out with where you were born, where you were educated, and how you started out in your career. So perhaps you can share that with the Sean in the Shed audience.
So I'm from Edinburgh originally, and then after school I headed down to the south for university. Went to the University of Oxford and then taught in London for 12 years before then kind of coming back halfway and settling in the northeast. My bread and butter is I'm head of school in a large secondary in Sunderland, but I'm also a writer. I write fiction. I wrote a novel called Fit that was out a few years ago, and a non-fiction on the state of schools called Examination, which came out in paperback last year.
That's great. And the topic for today is going to be social mobility and weaving Oracy into that conversation, because the new Oracy framework is going to be announced in 2026 and it's the focus of the current government. So social mobility is a passion of yours, Sammy. You worked down in the southeast, but more recently the northeast. Why is social mobility so important, and what is the difference in attitudes towards education in the southeast versus the northeast, and what can we do to raise the bar for everybody?
I mean, I think I have quite a complicated relationship with the notion of social mobility, because I am really, really passionate about the idea of opportunity. But what I also recognize is that the whole picture across the country is really, really complicated. And sometimes we can talk about social mobility in a way that's just like, seems almost just about people at the top, right? And just about trying to get opportunities to be the next judge or banker or whatever. And I think that the kind of social mobility that matters to me is really a sense of valuing all parts of our society and valuing the experiences that people have at every level. And really what you want is you want every child to have a life of choice and opportunity in front of them. And there'll be different choices in different contexts, but there has to be some element of choice. There has to be some element in which young people in school feel that they have some sense of mastery over what's happening to them.
And when it comes to social mobility, what are the big challenges? Because you've got perceptions, people are brought up in different ways, and there's different regions within the country, there's different attitudes. It's quite complex. If you look at, for example, mining towns that have been abandoned and there's less work, you have severe deprivation in certain towns, especially in the north. We talk about the north-south divide. So how do you change hearts and minds and attitudes towards creating wealth and creating an economy? Because ultimately in this country, we're not manufacturing as much as we should be. We'd be raising the GDP of the country, which then feeds back into the education system, into the health system. What do you see as the big issues that need to be tackled? And there's no silver bullet, but what would you be doing from a policy stance and from an initiative stance to really improve social mobility, in particular in the north of England?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think one of the big contrasts I saw between teaching kids in North London and teaching them in Sunderland was, fantastic children in both locations. Children are children, they're just great. But what you found was that if you grow up in North London, then, you may be from all sorts of different backgrounds, but opportunities are around you and they're visible. There's all of these institutions that you could go to study further. There's all these jobs. There's a sense that stuff is there. Now, it may well be that you live a very restricted life, but the distance that you need to travel, maybe even literally, is quite short. Whereas for the kids that I taught in Sunderland, one of the things that I noticed was that we'd often talk about opportunities, say, for example, looking at elite universities, trying to get kids to go to, Oxford and Cambridge and places like that. And obviously that's only a minor part of what you're trying to do for children, but it's a really good illustration of some of the genuine questions and barriers that arise. Because obviously, to ask someone who lives in Sunderland to go to university in Oxford is a different thing than to ask someone who lives in London to go there. It is literally further. You are going further from what you know. And if you are growing up in an environment which is a much more settled white working class culture like Sunderland, then the likelihood is that you haven't gone very far from that place, and that perhaps all of your family and your connections are very, very bound up in that place. So you have a much more solid sense of this is where I'm from and this is where I belong. So on top of that, the movement is more of a challenge. So you have the sense that actually it's not enough to simply talk about social mobility in terms of people making a move to where the opportunities are. What you have to take account of is that depending on where you start, the nature of movement feels different. And that's where you've got to ask this really difficult question of, if I'm saying to someone that they should go, culturally or physically far from where they were born and brought up, am I saying to them that their career is more important than their family? And should I be saying that? Because actually, in many senses, maybe what we should be saying is people should value the things that are giving them, emotional stability just as much as the things that might give them financial stability. So there's some really complicated things that start arising there, and that's before you even tackle the kind of long after effect of the industrial history of our country. Because of course, if you grow up in an area where the good jobs have all been associated with industry, then actually the notion of education, it has a different meaning to you. It's not the same as a place where opportunities have always come through education. If we're talking about an area like Sunderland, there are now loads of software jobs, but that is a relatively recent phenomenon. And therefore, in terms of your family background and what your parents and your grandparents might say, then actually you don't have that long-term environment that talks about education as the route towards success.
I mean, if you look locally to you in Sunderland, the local MP is the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, and she's from the northeast but went to Cambridge. But that would be the exception, not the main. You've obviously in Sunderland got the great football team, but you've got Nissan, you have got some industry. When you balance that act between being close to family and then going for wealth creation, going for higher powered careers, do people have to be sucked down into London? You're closer geographically to Edinburgh. Do you find people venture north? And when it comes to children growing up, how many people do move away from Sunderland because the jobs aren't there, or tend to stay there because they're in a so-called comfort zone and they don't want to get out of the comfort zone for good reason, like proximity to family and friends? Is that something that we should be encouraging people to do, move away, or is it irrelevant now with the internet and connectivity that actually, with knowledge workers working remotely, it's less of an issue, and that actually creates new opportunities for places like the Tyne and Wear?
I think what I would say with that is that, so first of all, it is true that there are there's a certain segment of the population who will move away for some of the more kind of more high-level jobs, particularly in things to do with civil service, to do with legal professions, to do with finance, because there aren't centres of that in Sunderland. But I do think there is an answer to all of this, and it is an answer which is starting to happen. So, for example, if you look at one of the things that's being discussed at the moment is how Manchester is the most thriving metropolitan area in Britain at the moment in terms of the economy, and a lot of that is put down to the way that devolution has been successfully harnessed there. And I think that there is definitely a very strong argument for saying that the solution to a lot of the issues around inequality in our country is about bringing the opportunities to people. It's about kind of structuring things in a way that mean that we kind of try and reverse that really, really massively over-centralized quality that the British state has. And as such, things like some of the initiatives to bring some of the media companies to the north, and there's a discussion. In fact, there's a new, I think it's the Inland Revenue have got their new building in Newcastle and stuff like that. All these things are really, really positive. And I think we need to push that further, because there is something else about kids. When they're in school, they're not stupid. They can see where the opportunities are. They can see where the jobs are. And if you say to them, do well in your exams because you're going to get X job or Y job, and they look around and they can't see the jobs there, then they will turn off from their engagement in education. So you need to have, even if people end up moving, you need to have the visibility of stuff in the local area. And I'll go a little bit further than that as well, because actually you mentioned the online space and kind of working remotely and so on. It's really, really important to remember that actually in the world that we live in, with the increased prevalence of online spaces, that makes physical infrastructure even more important. So I always think it's a little bit like, the invention of the car. The invention of the car, what it doesn't mean is that people then suddenly never need to walk. What it means is, parallel to the invention of the car, you get the invention of the gym. Because there isn't a kind of automatic assumption that people are going to be active in their everyday lives. So instead, you have to engineer a place where they can be active. So in terms of online spaces and so on, just because we can do stuff online doesn't mean we don't need the social spaces and the physical infrastructure as well. But what it does mean is that we need to actively construct that, because it won't just arise naturally through the kind of development of social spaces, if you see what I mean.
That brings us nicely into the whole topic of Oracy, because certainly if you're working from home and working remotely, you're replacing the commute with better communication skills, because you've got this communication overhead that you didn't have. How important is Oracy education now in schools for setting people up for success in the world of work? And maybe you can share some stories or some ideas around that, because some people are now saying it should be the fourth R. You've got reading, writing, arithmetic, and Oracy really should be coming to the forefront. What are your views on that, Sammy?
I think that we were chatting a little bit earlier, and I was saying that I sometimes have a problem with the idea of education always feeding into the world of work. But I do think that there is, when I talk to my son, he's in year 10, so he's 14, 15. And we're talking about his work experience. And I keep on saying to him that all of the things that you learn, and this is nothing to do with AI or technology or anything like this, but basically, if you want to be successful in any workplace, all jobs, if you get high enough, are management jobs. They're all about people management. That's just basically what work is. It's working with other people. So I think that's a really fundamental truth that we need to make sure that kids understand. But I think that Oracy has a role that goes far beyond that. And it's very simple. It's that if you're using Oracy well in a lesson, it is a tool of learning that has its own value, irrespective of anything else you're doing with it afterwards. So essentially, if I tell you something and then ask you to explain it back to me, cognitively, that is excellent learning. That is allowing you to kind of reconceptualize something, reflect it back to me, and that means that I know that you've understood it. So I'm an English teacher. What I know is that no one in my class has learnt something until they can tell me what they've learnt. Now, I can wait and make them write it as an essay. It's fundamentally the same thing. Or I can just ask them. And asking them is much, much quicker, and it gives me a much more instant feedback on it. And in addition, one of the things about a kind of oral response in the classroom is that it allows me, if you think about your kind of feedback and correction points, I get someone to write something, even if I get them something right, something very short, it's going to be 10 minutes before I can tell them whether it's right. And by that point, they might have started to embed lots of misconceptions. Whereas if I'm talking to them and they say within the first sentence something that's wrong, I go, oh, no, hang on, let's just start again, right? Off you go again. Then you have so many more points of correction that can allow you to develop that. And, you know, if I want to get really highfalutin on this, you know, this is why Socrates said that writing was a problem. Right? He famously said that writing was going to destroy Athenian culture, because oracy is much more a responsive, kind of thought-based method of discourse. Now, having said all that, there's a whole separate discussion at the moment, which is very, very interesting. There's lots of people writing on this, like James Marriott and Naomi Alderman and John Byrne Murdoch, all about the way that our culture is now becoming, in some ways, post-literate. Because what's happening is, you know, the prevalence of online forms, AI, etc., mean that people just aren't reading in the same way. So I think that when we talk about oracy in schools, it's legitimate to say it's the fourth R, but it's also really important to say that the other four still matter, right? Because what we need is, you know, we need the things that all of these provide. When you're reading, what you're doing is you're processing things in a slow and thoughtful way that is actually much more helpful in some aspects than doing them orally, because you're actually taking the time to think. And again, with writing, what you're doing is you're creating a considered sentence that actually you have to stop and refine and make sure is logical and coherent. So you need all of them, but you need them working together.
Absolutely. And whether you're a manager working with co-workers who are human beings or indeed AI agents, you've got to be able to clearly articulate what you're saying. And of course, it's not just about speaking, it's about listening. And it's not always about what you say, it's how you say it, isn't it, Sammy, for sure. So I couldn't agree more that oracy is really important. Just to finish off this conversation now, Sammy, it'd be good to talk about your future projects and your future work. I think there's a passion around what kids do outside of school. Perhaps you can share with the audience what you're planning to do with a future book around that, or any other projects that you're on with at the moment.
Yeah. So so after examination, so that was published with Vintage and Penguin, and they commissioned me to write a follow-up, which I managed to. I was very, very pleased that I've managed to get quite a long lead, because I'm doing some quite in-depth work with kids where I'm following them over a number of years. So examination was very bound up in, you know, interviews that I did with children and parents and so on. So essentially I'm doubling down on that technique, and I'm following some kids over a number of years to really see if I can build up a picture of their experiences in school and out of school, and see what conclusions we can draw from that. So it's not due out for another 2-3 years, but what I've found so far has been absolutely fascinating. And I would say that on a really simple level, you know, when I wrote examination, I wrote some recommendations for the education system, and I said, you know, we do need to think about radical change, but we're also really aware that change is difficult in an overstretched system. And as a response, as part of the kind of response on the discourse around that, a response, I'm not claiming that I'm the agent of this, but as part of the recent discourse, we had the curriculum and assessment review, which I engaged with as well. And it was interesting that, because they talked about changes that I think are perfectly reasonable, but there was a reluctance to commit to the idea of proper long-term deep change. And what I would say now is, having done this work with kids, thinking about how radically childhood has changed in recent years, how much it is a completely different thing to what we experienced back in the 80s in my own case, or you know, even back to the 2000s, I think. That has serious implications for what we need to do in schools. And as such, the provocative question I would put is, does anyone seriously think that our system is going to be the same in 2040? Are we going to have GCSEs, A levels, the curriculum as it is in 2040? No, we can't. That's not going to be a practical or possible position. And so therefore, what I would say is, if you look at actually what it takes to think properly about curriculum and structures and so on, if we want a different system in 2040, we need to plan it now. It's 2026 now. It takes that long to put things into place. The relatively minor adjustments that the curriculum assessment review suggested won't be fully in place until 2031, by which time we'll need to think about the next iteration. So, you know, I've tried to be quite constructive and moderate in the way I've talked about educational reform in the last few years as I've been promoting examination. But to be honest, I am getting to the point now where I think I need to be a little bit clearer and say we have to think radically. That doesn't mean we need to do the action immediately, but we have to do the thinking now in order to be ready for when we're going to need to put it into action.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Sammy. The rate of change, just the speed and the velocity of technology and the world as we live in it is just incredible at the moment. And keeping up is half the battle. So you're right, we do need to start thinking about where we're going to be in 10, 20 years' time. Sammy, it's been great talking to you today. If people want to get in touch with you, is there a blog? Is it LinkedIn, an email address? What's the best way to get in touch with you, Sammy?
So I do go on LinkedIn a fair amount, but also I've got a Substack where I try and put some kind of my more recent thinking and little bits and bobs from the research that I'm doing currently.
That's great. And that's Sammy Wright, who's a writer, author, and educator, joining us from Sunderland today, but originally from Edinburgh. Sammy, thank you so much for talking to us today on SeanInTheShed, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
In the shed.